Good afternoon. I'm Russell Wooldridge of DRI International, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this latest in our ongoing series of webinars. With these presentations, our goal is to advance the knowledge and understanding of our profession and look to where we're going next. Today's webinar acts as an introduction to DRI's prestigious Future Vision Committee, which has been formed to act as a global think tank on matters of operational resilience, discipline integration, and the future role of resilience professionals. Today's presenters will also discuss the trends for the upcoming year as identified in the committee's report. Issues to be discussed will include risk management and business continuity, cybersecurity, supply chain, and global recovery. Our speakers today are Al Berman, President of DRI International, Linden Bird, Chair of the Future Vision Committee, and several of its members, Linda Conrad, Head of Strategic Risk for Zurich Insurance Group, Wolfgang Mar, Veteran Consultant and Project Manager, and David Porter, Director of Business Continuity Management for the Australian Tax Office. We welcome your questions for our speakers. Please use the question box in most cases at the bottom of your control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Simply type in your questions at any time during the presentation. Address it to all panelists. We'll respond to as many of them as we can during the question and answer portion. You can manage the question window and other windows with the automatically appearing menu at the top of the screen. Now, let's hear from our experts in the field. First up is Al Berman, President and CEO of DRI International, to give us an overview of the Future Vision Committee and its role in DRI's current objectives.
Thank you, Russell. For a long time, DRI has been looking internally for answers. In recent years, we have moved to looking externally for answers. And so what you've seen from us is a move towards collegiate and the young leaders in resilience. Last year, we decided that we really had to look more outward for guidance as to what the industry was doing, what the profession was doing. And so the Future Vision Committee was created. And it was created to bring together as many disciplines and professions as we could. And so when you look at the committee, and you'll meet most of them later, you're going to see representatives from ISO, you're going to see it from the Red Cross, from the insurance industry and academia. And if you actually look at the head of the committee, who's Linden Bird, you will find that he comes from BCI, who many people regard as our biggest competitor. We do not. We regard it as an additional resource. And so while we concentrated on youth, we also realized that experience must be heeded. And the Future Vision Committee was created for that reason. And it consists of the most experienced and recognized names in continuity and risk management community. The committee's charter is to bring about information sharing through thought leadership and forums where ideas that will shape the future of resilience can be developed and shared. The esteemed members of the committee were sought out based on their qualifications, not their affiliations. We regard them as a great resource to the industry, to the profession, and to resiliency around the world. And so you will see from them a number of things. The first thing you'll see from them is the predictions for 2016. And we've asked for real predictions, things that we think very likely will happen. And we'll be able to follow how good they've done. The other thing is we're going to see a number of forums and webinars from them over the year. And so we are opening the committee to as many people as we can. Many of them will be at our conference in Atlanta in March. But the idea was to get the best and the brightest to try to predict and help us reach a more resilient state, because after all, that is DRI's goal.
Thanks, Al. Next, we'll hear from Linden Bird, the Future Vision Committee Chair. Mr. Bird has worked exclusively in business continuity since 1986 as a consultant, presenter, educator, author, and business manager. He helped found the Business Continuity Institute in 1994 to promote and develop the emerging BC discipline as a professional field of activity and was a member of the original BS 25999 Technical Committee. He was voted BCM Consultant of the Year in 2002 and given the BCM Lifetime Award in 2004 by Continuity Insurance and Risk magazine. He is currently editor of the Journal of Continuity and Emergency Planning published in the UK and the United States, an advisory board member of the U.S. publication Disaster Resource Guide, and his new book, Operational Resilience in the Financial Sector, has recently been published by Incisive Media. Linden, why was the Future Vision Committee founded?
The Future Visions Committee of the Disaster Recovery Institute International has been formed within the last year for a very specific reason. And that reason is that the subject of business continuity has become much wider than was traditionally the case. And it was felt that there was a need to start to look at the world as an entity rather than looking at business continuity as a very specific technical response to operational problems. So what do I mean by that? I mean that we need to look at the various things that are happening in our world and try and identify from those aspects which can cause us problems in running our businesses and our organizations. And the Future Visions Committee was put together to bring together a whole range of experts from different parts of the world who could provide expertise and thought leadership in some of the areas that we see as key to the problems that we're going to have to face. So the way that we've actually introduced this is to start looking in quite a populistic type of way of trying to do some forecasts, of saying to say, well, what are the sort of things we could forecast that will happen in the next year or so that could actually have a significant impact on our ability to make our organizations more resilient. And it isn't very difficult to find lots and lots of these. We only have to read the daily papers, see our TV bulletins, and we know what's going on. So we had a big problem really of trying to bring this down into things that made sense to business continuity people and in ways that we actually could make a difference to the way that organizations were able to become more resilient. And after discussions with various people, including people from the DRI, as well as our Future Visions Committee members, we've actually got this down to 10 items that we are really going to be concentrating on in 2016. And I'll just run through these very quickly for you. The first issue that we were looking at really is a very important one to the world, that is of cybercrime. And by cybercrime, this is a very wide subject. It includes actually things like cyber warfare, cyber espionage, cyber terrorism, as well as the more typical examples of fraud, which has been how people have focused on cybercrime in the past. So why is this causing a problem? Well, it's certainly causing a problem to all of our organizations, both in government, charity sectors, and very much so in businesses. Traditionally, finance and retail have been the hardest hit, but we're now starting to see big problems in the healthcare industry and other areas which had not necessarily been so subject to cybercrime. So this we see is a very big issue for our committee to look at. Secondly, slightly related, although it would appear quite different at first glance, that is supply chain disruption. But supply chain disruption is a fact that we change the model of how most businesses run. Rather than being local in our supply chains, we now operate where we can get the cheapest and the best deals worldwide. So supply chains for most global firms now are totally extended over the whole world. And each of the areas that these supply chains operate in are subject to their own disruptions, all of which can work their way back to the ultimate end user and the ultimate customer. So one of the things that, of course, could disrupt the supply chain would itself be cyber. But there are many other ways that the supply chain could be disruptive. Political actions, IT problems, natural disasters, very adverse weather conditions. So all of the other issues that we perhaps talk about as risks within the business continuity and resilience profession, could affect our supply chain. So that's why we see this is very strategically important. More obvious, terrorism, particularly what we're seeing from the Islamic terrorism. This is fairly straightforward. We don't know how this is going to pan out next year, but we know it's not going to go away. Since we've put the report together, there's been attacks in Turkey, there's been attacks in Indonesia, and this is an area that is really going to task our emergency services, emergency planners, as well as all our business continuity and resilience people next year, I think. slightly longer scale, but having an effect on the way we do business, is climate change. The agreements in Paris are, as what they say, they are agreements, but they aren't an action plan. So how is this going to pan out? Are governments going to really support it? Are companies really going to see the opportunities for green type products and change the way they're operating? Are there going to be changes in the way that businesses operate and that will affect resilience professionals as a result of climate change? We think there may be. They may be longer term than the exact year we're talking about. We think they'll start to kick in next year. Interestingly, then we've turned our attention to three other areas of geographic focus. As none of you will need reminding, there will be changes at the presidential level in the United States, and to some extent in the year waiting for that election, there's going to be stagnation in policy changes. So we're unlikely, we think, to see much government direction coming this year in terms of some of the issues that we see as key resilience issues. Maybe there will be more direction as we get past the presidential election, but certainly at this stage we think there'll be no bipartisan agreements on anything, and so there'll be a degree of problems for actually getting implementation of certain things that are important in the resilience field. Again, cyber could well be one that comes into that bag. Typically, we're talking also about European stability, issues with the Eurozone, financially, and actually issues of the overall stability of the European community areas as a result of the very large problems with migration that we're seeing from the areas that are affected by the civil war in Syria. Asian stabilities, everyone is now talking about what's going to happen with the Chinese economy, not only the economic issues and the fallout if the Chinese real estate and stock markets collapse, which will have big effects around the world, but there's also the practical issues in Asia. Clearly, it's subject to a lot of natural disasters and potential natural disasters. And certainly, we would expect within the committee to see problems in that area, some of them leading to severe financial problems for the particular region, others humanitarian disasters, which will no doubt task the agencies and the relief agencies enormously, as usual. Slightly more esoteric, I suppose, is one of the other risks we're talking about is systemic IT failures. And this is really about the complexity of IT and our dependency on it. We've always been dependent on IT and there's always been failures. But if you actually start to look at the way that most people live their lives and the way that all businesses and governments operate without a constant availability of IT, almost everything now becomes impossible. So we're expecting to see some high-profile IT failures, which may or may not be caused by sabotage, but are much more likely to be caused by technical failures or just managing change management and issues relating to the complexity of the systems. And then a couple of other points we're going to think about is regulation. Typically in the past, business continuity has tended to slip a bit under the radar for regulators. We think this is changing. We think that it no longer is going to be the case where firms will be able to be rather open in their own views, the way they deal with this. I think there's going to be more mandated standards, more requirements. And finally, perhaps one for our community more than the world to consider is risk management consolidation. And that is, to us, a key issue because typically there's been silos of business continuity, risk management, emergency management, security, etc., IT, disaster recovery. And all of them operating a bit in their own silos. We think this is going to come together. We think this is where it's going to start to come together. The term resilience is the banner term that's being used, but I think someone is going to be the lead discipline in this. And I guess this is going to be what I call a consolidation of the risk management disciplines, which I think we'll start to see this year. So those 10 areas, some of them practical issues, some of them policy issues, and some of them basically regulatory issues. But I think those are all areas that our business continuity and resilience professionals have to deal with this year.
Thank you, Linden. Our next speaker is Linda Conrad. As head of strategic risk, Ms. Conrad leads a global team responsible for delivering tactical solutions to Zurich and to customers on strategic issues such as business resilience, cyber and supply chain risk, enterprise risk management, risk culture, and total risk profiling. She holds a specialist designation in ERM and serves on the Global Education Advisory Board for the Institute of Risk Management in London. She is also deputy member of the ERM Committee of REMS, sits on the Supply Chain Risk Leadership Council, and was chairwoman of the Asian Risk Management Conference. She taught at the University of Delaware's Captive Program and in the Master's Program on Supply Chain Management at the University of Michigan's Ross School of Business, where she serves on the Corporate Advisory Council. Linda, what are the trends and predictions in supply chain management that you see?
The first thing we're going to talk about is supply chain disruption. Traditionally, organizations tended to source their raw materials and services relatively locally, even if they were selling their goods and services nationally or internationally. However, the past 2 decades have seen a reversal of this trend, with most organizations setting up complex and long-distance supply chains. These have adopted other strategies such as just-in-time manufacturing, sometimes just-in-sequence manufacturing, lean manufacturing, and outsourcing. Taken together, these measures have produced good financial returns, with costs being dramatically reduced for companies. But sometimes customer service, quality, reliability, and delivery appear compromised. Countries such as Japan, Germany, and others have retained tight controls on their core businesses and on their intellectual property, despite having many overseas subsidiaries. So there's clearly a trade-off between cost and resilience. And many high-profile supply chain interruptions, such as those resulting from the natural disasters in Asia, have highlighted this and caused strategic rethink at some corporations. With all these global challenges in mind around the supply chain, DRI has come up with a prediction. They believe that at least one international firm will collapse or be rescued by a fire sale to avoid bankruptcy as a direct result of supply chain failure. With this prediction as our background, let's dig a little bit deeper into it. So here's some of the challenges and exposures around supply chain. Global sourcing and these greater independencies have not necessarily been mapped at many companies or quantified in terms of the impact they might have if there is a bottleneck or a potential loss exposure from these disruptions. Couple this with things like sole sourcing and of critical suppliers, perhaps with lower inventory levels being held, new products, etc. And what we have is the potential for significant profit and loss damage and brand impact. What happens is often those actions taken by folks in procurement to drive cost out of the supply chain can inadvertently drive in increased risk into the company. And so procurement and risk management areas may not be able to mitigate these things alone. So this is where folks in the resiliency profession can really bring in an added benefit. Even if it involves financial insolvency of a supplier, having some idea about what's going to happen down the road and how you would recover and how much it would cost is really key. Damage to suppliers' facilities can really affect production, distribution, governmental regulations can impact, customs, transportation issues like we saw last year with the port slowdown in California, IT and power outages, strikes, and more. So interestingly, when we look at the disruptions that we have in this database, what we find is something surprising. You may imagine that one of the top drivers of supply chain risk comes from physical damage, such as we saw as what happened in Asia, where there was flooding, or there was the tsunami in Japan, flooding in Thailand, etc. But in fact, this type of physical damage doesn't even rank in the top 3. So as I mentioned, the number one cause of supply chain disruption last year was cyber. It may not be a data loss like we think of companies where they've had their information compromised. It may be something as simple as a software upgrade or glitch that has caused a lack of communication between the suppliers and the purchasers. Disruptions have occurred in the surveys that we've seen with about 85% of companies. Ultimately, about 40% of companies suffering extended supply chain disruptions never recover, out of business entirely. That is not what we want to happen to your organizations. So what can we do about it? One thing that can be done is a supply chain risk assessment where you apply basically the business continuity mindset to your suppliers. focusing on key suppliers that could have the most critical impact to you, whether that means the ones you purchase the most for or the ones that provide the most critical parts. So all that summed up to say that there are some key questions that you might want to ask yourself, and I'm going to go through 10 of them. Questions include, do you know who your critical suppliers are and how much their failure would impact your company's profits? Number 2, have you fully mapped your critical supply chains upstream to the raw material level and downstream to the customer level? Number 3, have you integrated risk management type processes into your supply chain risk management approach? That includes business continuity. Number 4, do you have routine, timely systems for measuring the financial stability of critical suppliers and looking at their response plans? Number 5, do you understand your top-tier production facilities and logistics hubs and where they might be exposed to natural catastrophes or other events? Number 6, is supply chain risk management integrated into your overall enterprise risk management approach? Again, this is where resiliency professionals live and breathe. Number 7, do you record details of supplier incidents and the actions that you have put in place to avoid future incidents? Number 8, do your tier 1 suppliers, again, those top tier direct suppliers, have business continuity plans with you? And have they been tested in terms of their viability? Number 9, have you provided risk training and resiliency training to your supply chain risk management team? And finally, is risk and resiliency on the agenda at performance meeting with your strategic suppliers? So in sum, all of these questions hopefully give you enough to start a dialogue outside of your area, working alongside with your supplier procurement and purchasing team and with your risk management team, perhaps bringing in some other folks from legal and other areas, but start to ask and answer these questions and you'll be more further down the road on having a better resiliency plan that hopefully will allow you to avoid or at least mitigate and manage supplier disruptions in the future. We're now going to talk about climate change. The UN Climate Change Conference, COP21, provided a framework agreement between nations, but nothing that is immediately implementable. Western governments' main focus will be on building an effective strategy to counter the threat posed by ISIL and others so that climate change will receive less high-level attention. China and India will continue their rapid industrialization and increase the use of coal and other fossil fuels. However, individual firms in North America and Europe will better see the massive potential for quote-unquote green solutions and look to develop and market such technologies. So this might start to herald the beginning of changes in the way that we plan our cities, our businesses, and our lives, and will certainly give opportunities for technological transformation on a scale that has not really been seen since the Industrial Revolution. However, these declarations need to be turned into action, and we probably all need to remain cautious about expecting too much too soon. While we should not confuse climate change with short-term weather events, it is difficult not to be concerned about how communities cope if the extreme weather conditions, such as experienced in many parts of the world recently, become a regular feature. So with that background from the DRI, their prediction from DRI is that flooding will be the most obvious manifestation of climate change, and that there will be many disasters in areas around the globe that are not traditionally prone to such events. In the Global Risks Report that was just released last week, failure of climate change mitigation is the #1 global risk in terms of impact. We're seeing that issues like climate change failure are now seeping into our psyche, but ultimately they should begin to surface in our strategy. So let's take a look at things that are related to climate change mitigation. So failure to adapt to climate change is interconnected with the following events: extreme weather, water crises, food crises, biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse, and of course, natural catastrophes. So one of the things that we've noticed is that failure to mitigate and adapt to climate change is actually the top most impactful risk. So specifically for global companies, consequences of climate change pose huge challenges. Things such as cooling of production sites and warehouses, even cooling of the electronic equipment that we all use on a regular basis is related to water, which could be impacted by these extremes in weather that come from climate change. In addition, natural catastrophes are causing supply chain interruptions and damage to infrastructure is increasing. as we all saw in things like Superstorm Sandy. And of course, increasing price volatility comes along with that. We also see that there's fierce competition for water, which is, of course, the lifeblood of agriculture, but other things that we mentioned around cooling, production, and electronics. The largest water user by far is agriculture, and this has exposure to all types of businesses, including food and beverage companies, chemical companies, manufacturers, and frankly, all of those of us who like to eat should be concerned about this. In fact, withdrawal of fresh water increased threefold over the last 50 years, and demand is anticipated to rise a further 40% by 2030. And this is where you could come in to start to proactively look at what the exposures are that your company may face, not only in your own locations, but in those of your key suppliers. Start to map and quantify those and actually look at what your alternate plans are before the impact of climate change may start to impact you. We've talked about the need for companies and those in resiliency professionals within companies to start to look at this proactively, but also as you work with the broader governments and cities in which you are located. Mitigation really requires well-considered urban planning and good governance with effective regulatory frameworks. So stronger city-level institutions may begin to provide that greater scope for practical solutions. So sustainable growth and governance will increasingly demand that there's collaboration and innovation from multiple stakeholders, and this is where we all come in together. This would include city leaders, academia, civil society, private sector, and of course, all of us in this profession that are related to DRI. We're now going to talk about regulations. According to DRI, while firms have many legal obligations and risks that can result in severe financial penalties or even imprisonment of executives, business continuity has largely been under the radar of the authorities. It is likely to change as this whole question of governance, risk, and compliance, or as it's known, GRC, becomes embedded into corporate culture. It is conceivable that a named individual may actually be required and held legally responsible for all aspects of GRC across an enterprise, including business continuity and risk management factors. Interestingly, U.S. regulators are becoming more aggressive about auditing third-party vendors' cyber preparedness. So this pattern will be followed by other regulators across the world and enforced by global auditing firms. Consequently, many international organizations may begin to refuse to use suppliers whose cybersecurity is found to be lacking, or whose business continuity plans are not up to speed. Many small suppliers may begin to complain that this unfairly favors large corporations who can more easily afford compliance overhead and risk management oversight. But the prediction from DRI is simple. They expect that decisions about supply chain, with emphasis on resilience and reliable business partners, will favor large corporates and increase merger and acquisition activity to the potential detriment of smaller suppliers who are more easily impacted. So what we'd like to look at is this overarching concept of governance, risk, and compliance, and as it's often called, enterprise risk management, and where this fits into the picture of building business resiliency. So let's look at some critical insights to creating global risk resilience. It's important that those of us in this professional, risk management and resiliency management, start to move away from being event-focused and embracing a more holistic view. So there are some examples of misleading conclusions that are very obvious in the world out there. But the best way to start to look at this interconnectedness, trying to take an enterprise approach, where you basically go up in the helicopter, or maybe we should say a drone now, and have a different view of the overall resiliency. Those in this profession can help the C-suite, the CEO, CFO, chief legal, and other staff consider these interconnections, both aggregations and correlations of risk, and how that can increase the impact of any one event on a firm. So in terms of interconnectedness, it's important to know not just where there is an exposure, but how does it impact your strategic plan? Which of your objectives can be influenced, and then adjust your operational execution accordingly. Because there can be unexpected groupings or knock-on effects or cascades that we're all familiar with in the resiliency area that should be taken into consideration at this governance, risk, and compliance or enterprise level. Also, when you look at it from companies that have projects and initiatives, You want to think, has there been a similar type of assessment, not only of the risk to the project itself, but what is the impact to the entire company? And where this project is not successful, what is the enterprise cost of risk, and how could going back to see if the project is attained successfully has it achieved its expected ROI? So these are important concepts to look at from the resiliency perspective. What we see is that resilience and risk management tools are meant to help inform these qualitative judgments based on experience and not replace them. A study going back last year that was done by the Risk and Insurance Management Society shows that during the financial crisis, only 20% of companies saw risk and resiliency management as a strategic asset. But this year, that figure is around 79%. So we can see that these risk tools can be most effective when used at the strategy development stage. Resiliency requires more than just a typical approach to business continuity planning. In fact, it goes beyond just an organization's ability to bounce back. Instead, we should focus on not bouncing in the first place. This is where the competitive advantage comes in from proactive identification and treatment of exposures, both with your own locations and with your suppliers. There's been plenty of examples where we encourage people to determine if they have a robust business continuity plan that is fit for purpose by doing regular gap analysis of your business continuity plan. In conclusion, the predictions from DRI and the evidence we've seen in the Global Risks Report from the World Economic Forum in Zurich highlight that there is a resiliency imperative. This resiliency imperative stresses the fact that effective risk management needs to take into consideration interdependencies between risks and then proactively adjust strategy and operations accordingly. So it's no longer enough to be focused on one event or one particular element of risk, but looking at those interconnections is really key. It's also important to look at what options are available to mitigate those, from proactive changes to your strategy or your operations, from having a good business continuity plan in place, and even from looking at transferring some of the risk through insurance coverage, such as political risk coverage for expropriation and currency and convertibility, looking at supply chain insurance coverage, looking at your property coverage, or even cyber insurance cover are key things to take some of that risk out of the equation for you. But finally, all of this brings us to a call to action. This is a requirement, again, a resiliency imperative towards more holistic risk management approaches. And this includes business continuity management stress testing that is really required to see whether our plans are operating as we would expect it if there's an issue. And these issues must be addressed at the highest levels of the companies, at the board level. So the board should really own the risk and resiliency agenda because they own the strategy. Risk and strategy are inherently intertwined, and the board's role and the executive team's role is to set that agenda, drive this culture of risk and resiliency awareness, and ultimately to oversee the implementation throughout the organization. So again, when it comes to risk and resilience, we don't just want to be prepared to bounce back. We don't want to have the issues and bounce in the first place. So handing off to all of us in the resiliency professional to step up and take a broader role in addressing all of these large global risks.
Thank you, Linda. Next up is David Porter, who has been the Director of Business Continuity Management at the Australian Taxation Office since September 2010. He has also chaired a whole-of-government BCM community of practice with members from over 35 Commonwealth and state-based agencies. Mr. Porter and his team provide regular monitoring support of other organizations and have contributed towards readiness activities across the public sector and wider financial industries. Mr. Porter is a regular presenter at industry events and a contributor to the Business Continuity Institute Oceania 2020 think tank. David, can you give us the perspective from Australia and tell us how it relates to the global picture?
I'm going to cover a couple of topics today, primarily with an Australian focus. We are a truly global industry and practice, So from an Australian perspective, my expertise is primarily within the public sector. However, we're finding within the public sector that there is an increasing reliance and partnerships that are occurring across the private sector as well. So I have a government background, and for example, we're finding ourselves connecting more intrinsically with the banking sector, for example. Some of the trends we're seeing in Australia at the moment, particularly in the public sector, is that it's a much more open field now for the continuity and resilience discipline. We're finding that public sector agencies are increasingly required to work together for efficiencies, but also to provide a seamless service for citizens. So the concept of public sector agencies all doing their own thing, running their own show, running their own systems, all in completely different stovepipes or silos or whatever separation you'd like to use. That kind of methodology is on its way out, and we're increasingly seeing partnerships and shared services across different government agencies, which raises a new challenge for the continuity discipline, which has traditionally been a very inwardly focused discipline within the organisation. So with the increasing expectations of the community and the seamless ability to transact across government, because at the end of the day, citizens don't necessarily care which agency they deal with. They just know they're dealing with the government as a whole. So there's an increased responsibility for agencies to share data, to work with each other more collaboratively. And what we're seeing is a really good opportunity at the same time. It's a challenge, but still an opportunity to actually realise some efficiencies across a network of agencies. So part of my work in Australia has been to chair a community of practice of Australian government agencies focusing on the continuity discipline. We have about 35 agencies at a national level that all congregate on a monthly basis. And we work through common or shared risks or vulnerabilities or planning that we might all need to be conscious of, and there's actually an opportunity for us to work together. So particularly for planning around significant events like political events or things like the G20 summits, APEC summits and similar, where we all have a degree of shared risk and responsibility. We're also seeing elements of, more open collaboration in the private sector as well. Similarly, you'll find a lot of private sector companies joining up forces and, working together on solutions that affect multiple customers. So things like authentication options, which might be a common system across various banks. We'll also see some changing paradigms around use of voice biometrics and other biometrics to access services, different identifiers. And another element happening in Australia is the new payments platform, which will be progressively introduced over the next couple of years or so. And what that will mean is it will actually change how some of the private and public sector organisations transact, not just financially, but also the data or information that goes with the transaction will also change too. So there's some very granular stuff there, but at the end of the day, a landscape that is moving to one that is very agile and has a heightened degree of resilience and availability and reliability that consumers, customers, or even citizens are expecting. There's a couple of elements out of the paper that's being presented around some future predictions coming over the horizon. So a couple I'd like to focus on are risk consolidation and regulation. So risk consolidation first is the concept of the protective disciplines of security and continuity and risk management all kind of coming together under a risk management umbrella from an organisational structural perspective. There's no set methodology for where business continuity and resilience or related disciplines fit within an organisation. It will vary depending on the size and nature of the organisation. For example, in the Australian Taxation Office, we have our continuity discipline as an extension of our large operational areas, as opposed to sitting in a risk management or governance area. We find that positions us very closely to the happenings of our business, and we're able to very quickly identify issues and vulnerabilities and respond right across our environment if we're closely embedded with the operational arm of our work, as opposed to being more under a policy or governance or guidance kind of capability. with the consolidation of the potential for consolidation under risk management, you can find that you can obtain a good single source of truth across the organisation for those protective disciplines. Gives you a really good opportunity for security and risk management, particularly to be closely aligned. You need to make sure that you still retain the active element within each of those protective disciplines that allows for detection and analytics, and I guess the ability to remain agile would be quite important. The other element that I was going to look at was regulation. This is an interesting one, and it, I guess, varies significantly from country to country. Within Australia, we find, like most, our banks and government areas are quite well regulated. We're probably seeing an increase in the requirements and assurances of third-party providers that we have. And I guess that's a bit of a common trend that we find, particularly large organisations are in the business of often engaging third parties or outsourcing various elements of their work as opposed to building things in-house, and maybe adopting a standards-based approach for some of their third-party suppliers or third-party deliverables. So what we find is that there's increasingly the organisation at its core with a large outer ring of different providers with different business models servicing different entities themselves. So there's a really interesting piece around those types of third-party suppliers that are in industries or providing services that don't necessarily have the same type of regulation that banks or government institutions would have. How does regulation work and apply for those types of entities as well, to ensure that at the end of the day, if they're providing or supporting critical services for a high-profile organisation, that they're just as well protected as the organisation itself, or as well assured as the organisation itself. The other interesting part about regulation that I see is that whilst we'll have often decreed regulations and things we line up with, there's an interesting bit of social regulation that probably also occurs as well. And when I say social regulation, I mean that the clients and the market will often, to a degree, perform a regulating activity by increasing their expectations through social and mainstream media, particularly when things aren't working well. But you can almost find that by demanding a seamless and available and fit-for-purpose surface, that clients in a way can actually perform a regulatory role that can actually drive the strategy for a business to decide to make itself more resilient. So you can see any number of situations where clients and customers through social media are able to not only engage with the business that they're dealing with, but engage with an audience that's very receptive and often very quick to jump on a common bandwagon. So we can probably see in a way that can force an organisation to look to respond more actively than what it might have done in the past, to try and sort of appease the initial client, but also the public sentiment that might grow through social media initially, and then possibly even into mainstream media. We always see those reports on the news of the latest viral video or response or things. So there's an interesting element here around regulation, around the informal social regulation that might exist. And you might actually find that reliability is a commercial advantage that your organisation might be able to provide over others. The final piece I'd like to cover today probably centres more around the climate change elements. Now, I'm not a meteorologist, I'm not a scientist, I don't have a particular qualification in this regard, but the thing that I do have is a backyard that is increasingly getting flooded these days. So from an Australian perspective, we used to have, or we still do have, a very active cyclone season, or they may be referred to as hurricanes or typhoons in other lands, but we will often have up to about a dozen cyclone events across the top of our country during the summer months. And at the same time, we could actually be having bushfire events and heat waves and severe storms across other parts of the country all at once. So for us, whilst there's a wider debate and consideration around climate change itself and the frequency and positioning of severe storm and similar weather events, there's I guess, regardless of where that conversation lands, the reality is that we need to be conscious about factoring in the propensity of significant weather events into our continuity and resilience planning. So some of the stuff we've been doing is ensuring our buildings are outside certain flood levels, like the 1 in 100 year flood predictions, working across other government agencies to ensure we've got ready access to alternate building locations, and to also, as a big organisation ourselves, offer services to other organisations. So we're seeing a lot more of that shared response and planning around not just our typical continuity events that we face, but some of these shifting sands around the external environment as well.
Thanks, David. Our next presenter is Dr. Wolfgang Mar. Dr. Mar has over 20 years of experience in consulting and project management in the ICT environment, and over the last 15 years has specialized in the field of business continuity management. He is experienced in IT governance, information security, business management, marketing, account and product management, in professional education as an author of educational content and an international speaker. Wolfgang, what are the trends and predictions that you see in global cybersecurity?
So let me just have some words on the safety security situation in Europe, maybe with in conjunction with business continuity. We face, of course, a less stable and less silent Europe as compared to maybe 1, 2, 3 years ago. There is a trend towards more national activities within the 20 to 30 countries in Europe. Nobody calls for an ever closer European Union, and there is even a threat or a possibility that one of the largest members, Great Britain, might leave the Union. I personally rather think this is a very realistic scenario as opposed to some other people. But from what I can gather, there might be a chance that the British might leave the bloc, which of course has implications also in our profession in BCM. Think about all the legislation changes, regulation changes, the advantages gained or lost by one or the other company. So I'd rather propose to be prepared for this scenario as well. There is no guarantee that things might remain unchanged. On the southern border, southeastern border in Europe, we have Greece, which is a country facing financial problems, and the Greek also happened to be at the forefront of the migrant crisis. The Greek border is partially part of the EU border, and those millions of people which already have arrived in Europe, most of them came through Greece. So this has to be addressed, and maybe there is not a direct impact to BCM. We have to have an eye on this secure situation. The migrant crisis is certainly a gripping subject for all of us. If a model country like Germany faces instability and unrest, it's certainly an alarm light, and many things which were given as granted or which were usual, like traveling across borders without a customs inspection, without identity checks, are maybe a thing of the past for one in other situation. So there is an impact, probably also in logistics. So if trucks and transportations are stopped at the border, timetables can probably no longer be achieved, and this has to be taken into account. Just yesterday I heard about an enormous IT challenge for Germany to handle the migration problem. If you imagine that 1 million people have to be registered in several federal departments, several ministries, and more than a dozen provinces and 5,000 cities, we can imagine that we face an IT and database problem. There is a lot to be improved, and the security of these registration systems are by no means a given thing. We hear of additional work to be undertaken by the officials, and the registration process as such probably is not 100% secure in terms that everyone gets registered and correctly registered, whatever. Which leads me to the next topic, cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is an emerging threat in our field, especially in the BCM environment. The information security triad is CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And of course, BCM is availability, so we have certainly an overlap. So from our point of view, the BCM perspective or BCM point of view, cyber security or cyber threats are a new, very important discipline in BCM, which has to be addressed in the BIA and, of course, in the business continuity strategy. Let me briefly outline how I see cyber threats and cybersecurity. It's in the data domain, one of the 5 domains we are living in. We have 3 dimensions in our normal space. Then we have the data domain, and maybe more in the military field, but nevertheless important, is the frequency domain. So we have an approach, or we have an attack in 5 dimensions. And cybersecurity, cyber threat is one of these dimensions, of course. The threats are silent, ultra fast. There is no big bang, no smoke, no explosion, no whatever. You might not even know that you are under attack and that you have been compromised. So it's on the very fast edge of the spectrum, whereas BCM maybe is in the middle, where we have slow to moderate events like, let's say, a hurricane, where we have a warning of 24 hours or whatever, a flood where we might be warned several hours in advance. If there's a fire, we might still get out of the building within a couple of minutes. But there are also, of course, very fast events like power outage, where it's getting dark within a fraction of a second. On the other end of the spectrum, just to frame the contents, are aspects which are covered by what can be called organizational resilience. These are maybe slower events like threats coming up due to changes in legislation or exchange ratios or social unrest in a production site or in the region, something which might not kill us next week or next month, but if unchecked, it might well affect the company or an organization a year or so down the road.
And now for your questions. Al, Linden, and I are happy to answer as many as we can in the time we have left. If you have a question, you can type it in the bar at the bottom right hand of the window. Please make sure you address it to all panelists.
And as is usually the case, we've had a number of people ask very similar questions, gentlemen. And so the first one is going to go to Linden. Linden, given some of the hugely large strategic problems we've discussed, how can the average BC practitioner or BC professional be able to deal with those kind of huge strategic problems?
Well, this is a question that really is at the nub of the whole issue of business continuity and resilience management. And I think I have to start by saying very clearly that for most of these large problems, we or no individuals, not even presidents of countries, can really change the overall risk factor very easily or significantly at all. So what we can do is we can change our ability to manage the outcome of these problems. And if you actually think about that, that's what we've always done in business continuity, is we've managed the outcome of things which actually we had very little control about. You know, we managed the outcome from pandemics, but very few of the people in our profession are medically qualified, for example. So I don't think, in fact, the size of the threat is really the issue. The issue is, what are the types of things that we have to be able to manage ourselves in our organizations? And I'll give you an example. Cyber, massive threat. We do not have to be in the business continuity profession the leading technical experts in all aspects of protecting cyber. What we do have to understand, though, is how vulnerable our organizations are to what. And isn't that exactly what we've always done with BIA? Isn't the BIA what we've actually looked at? Not what has happened, but what is the consequence of what might happen. So I think with a little bit of modification into the processes of BIA, we can very, very quickly make a big contribution to cyber. Supply chain, absolutely. And Linda, in her talk, very, very strongly talked about the need for business continuity to work together with procurement professionals and all other aspects of the supply chain, because clearly anything that can go wrong for us can go wrong for any single supplier of any service to us. So really, to me, the word we've got to look at is collaboration rather than conflict with our suppliers. And that's got to be the watchword for, I think, for the business continuity people to be able to sell within their organizations that the suppliers are actually people we have to actually trust and work with, rather than simply see as someone that we get the best deal from. So what are business continuity people good at? Well, I think they're good at managing complex dependencies. They're good at scenario planning, because we do a lot of that. And they're very good at putting together interesting and challenging exercises. And all of those three areas, which actually we all do as part of our daily jobs without thinking about them, are actually essential to being able to get an organization that is able to deal with these large threats that may or may not affect it. And I turn the question back really on that one and say, well, if we don't do it in our organizations, who will? So I hope that helps.
Excellent. Al, what level of importance does an organization that's managed by processes rather than functions get a better result in terms of risk management and continuity?
Well, I think the difference between functions and process sometimes gets blurred, Russell, simply because the process probably transcends most of the functions. And so what we're really looking at is the end product delivery, the ability to service customers. So whether we decide it's a functional thing or a process-driven thing, probably depends on your point of view. As an ex-CIO, we always look at process. As an ex-CEO, we always look at function. And so we need to collaborate on those 2 points and be able to transcend that. I think Linda's comment about how we can contribute really helps us. If we look at the BIA process and we look at it from a functional point of view, we're probably measuring the wrong things today. We don't combine those with the risk management process, if you will, to be able to come up with the right insurance means to offset or risk transfer some of the problems that we faced. So BIAs don't actually measure the things that we needed to do to be able to collaborate with risk managers insurance, specifically in looking at business interruption or contingent business interruption and extra expense. And it's that kind of value that combines process and function to give us a holistic approach to this.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is kind of a follow-on for that, Al, because of some of the remarks that Linda made during her presentation. One of our listeners asked about, in terms of global risk resiliency, isn't it not wanting to pull the trigger or to balance in the first place? Would you consider that unrealistic? Wouldn't it be a better strategy to recover, absorb the problem, adapt, that being a more realistic model than maybe balance in the first place?
Not sure I understand the question.
I wasn't either. That's why I asked it the way I did.
Thanks, Russell. I always get the easy ones.
Right, exactly.
I think this holistic approach, and I have really gathered a lot of information from Linda's studies, that we need to take a much higher level look at what we do. I mean, if our obligation to our organization is to make them more effective at the time of a disaster and to reduce the consequences, then we have to take a better look at it. We tend to measure the wrong things. We tend to look at the wrong things. We tend to sit in what technology people do, and we hide behind words, terms like RTO and RPOs and BIAs, when we're really trying to look at how do we mitigate the consequences of disasters. And I think that's what we have to do. We have to literally take apart what we've been doing
and decide what our objective is. Our objectives are not RTOs and RPOs. It's really to reduce the effects of disaster on our organization and communities as a whole.
Thank you, gentlemen, for answering our listeners' questions today. Before we sign off, we want to invite you to test your skills against our new cyber attack simulation developed with Experiences Unlimited. Can you lead your team through a cyber attack? Do you have what it takes to meet the challenge? Follow the link on the screen to see if you can successfully navigate this threat scenario. Then learn how your response stacked up against others during the Cyber Attack Simulation Experience Results Revealed session at DRI 2016 in Atlanta on Monday, March 7th. This presentation will examine how to immerse participants in best practices for crisis leadership, challenging them to develop the critical thinking and judgment skills required to respond to and lead during a crisis. For more information, visit driconference.org. If you still have questions that we didn't cover, or you'd like to schedule a training for yourself or your team, give us a call at 866-542-3744. A recording of this and all our other webinars is posted on MyDRI. I'm Russell Wooldridge, and this webinar has been a production of DRI International 2016, all rights reserved. Thank you for your attention.